They clapped for the chief executive's son right in front of me, treating me like a ghost in my own boardroom. Those smiling executives had no idea the strategy they were praising was a complex survival system that only its creator could actually operate. I did not scream or beg for my stolen credit. I simply placed my plastic badge on the glass table, walked out, and let them drive their stolen ship straight into a hurricane. My name is Charlie Mendoza. I am 38 years old, and until about 5 minutes ago, I was the Director of Operational Strategy at Asteron Fleet Technologies. Sitting in the glass-walled boardroom on the 20th floor overlooking the gray, unforgiving skyline of Columbus, Ohio, I felt the familiar, gritty burn of exhaustion behind my eyes. The heavy leather folder resting on the polished mahogany table in front of me held the absolute pulse of the entire company. It was a dense, unforgiving blueprint that had cost me 4 solid months of sleepless nights, lukewarm coffee, and missed family dinners. I knew every single comma, every terrifying financial projection, and every brutal operational cut required to keep the lights on in this building. Asteron Fleet Technologies was standing on the absolute edge of a sheer cliff. We had 3 major distribution centers hemorrhaging cash every single day. Our freight contracts were bloated well past any reasonable budget, bleeding millions due to outdated penalty clauses. The entire supply chain was a tangled, chaotic mess, following 2 consecutive quarters of catastrophic, undeniable failures. The air in the boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and unspoken panic. The document resting under my hands was not just a polite corporate suggestion, it was an extremely detailed, surgical restructuring plan. I had personally mapped out the exact, painful process to amputate 2 deeply unprofitable regional markets. I had drafted the aggressive terms needed to renegotiate with our primary suppliers, meticulously realigned the entire transit hub network to eliminate dead routes, and built a strict, week-by-week implementation roadmap. It was a survival guide, calibrated down to the very last cent. I had built it from the raw, ugly, fragmented data up, pulling numbers from reluctant regional managers and matching them against cold reality. The massive projector screen at the front of the room hummed quietly as the final slide of the deck faded to black. The room was perfectly quiet for a fraction of a second, the heavy, suffocating kind of quiet that always follows a brutal truth. Then, the sharp scraping of a heavy chair broke the silence. Mason Pike, our lead investor, the man who held the massive purse strings that could either save or sink us, stood up at the far end of the long table. He looked around the room, a wide, deeply satisfied smile breaking across his weathered face. He brought his hands together and started to clap. It was slow, deliberate, booming applause. "Brilliant," Mason said, his voice echoing sharply against the glass walls. "Truly brilliant. Preston, I have to say, this is exactly the kind of company-saving vision we have been waiting for." Preston Bell, Vice President of Strategy, the Chief Executive Officer's son, Preston sat directly across from me. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my entire first year of college tuition. He leaned forward, resting his perfectly manicured hands on the table, and let out a soft, heavily rehearsed exhale. He offered the room a smile that was the exact, calculated mixture of false humility and quiet confidence. "Thank you, Mason," Preston said, his voice smooth, resonant, and incredibly steady. "It has been a grueling process, naturally, but true leadership in a crisis means making the hard choices. It means seeing the forest for the trees and having the courage to execute a clear vision, no matter how painful the necessary cuts might be." He spoke the words with the solemn gravity of a war hero returning from the front lines. Not once, not for a single, fleeting fraction of a second, did his eyes dart in my direction. He did not gesture toward my seat. He did not mention the strategy department or the endless nights my team endured. He simply opened his hands and claimed the entire 4 months of my blood, sweat, and data as his own personal, undeniable triumph. At the absolute head of the table sat Warren Bell, the chief executive officer, and Preston's father. Warren leaned back in his high-backed leather executive chair, his hands steepled thoughtfully under his chin. He was looking at Preston with an expression of pure, unadulterated pride. It was the distinct look of an aging king watching his chosen prince finally lift the heavy sword. All around the massive table, the other board members were nodding in perfect unison. They murmured their deep agreements, exchanging relieved, knowing glances with one another. They looked at Preston as if they had just witnessed the glorious coronation of their rightful heir. I sat perfectly frozen in my chair, the cold recycled air conditioning suddenly biting at my skin. My lungs felt uncomfortably tight, as if the oxygen had been vacuumed right out of the room. I had dealt with Preston taking credit for my ideas before. In this particular industry, in this specific company, a certain amount of intellectual theft from superiors was just considered the unspoken tax you paid to play the corporate game. I was used to my weekly reports being quietly rebranded as his executive initiatives in casual morning meetings. I was used to him tweaking a few adjectives and presenting my minor logistical adjustments as his own strokes of genius. But this was entirely different. This was not a minor internal meeting. This was not a small operational tweak. This was outright, shameless. Daylight robbery right in front of the board of directors and the primary investors. He was actively claiming full authorship of the exact, delicate machinery needed to steer the company through its most critical survival phase. They were blindly handing him the wheel of a massive, actively sinking ship, entirely based on the complex map that I alone had drawn. He did not know how to actually read that map. He did not know why certain logistical cuts were made and why others were strategically spared. He only knew how to read the bullet points on the slide deck. The heavy applause faded into a warm chorus of mutual congratulations. They were already eagerly discussing the rollout phases, carelessly throwing around the strict timelines I had agonized over for countless hours. I looked down at the glossy, pristine cover of my dossier. I looked across the table at Preston, who was now leaning back in his chair, deeply soaking in the corporate validation. I looked at Warren, who was clearly mentally writing his long-awaited succession plan. A strange, icy calm suddenly washed over me. It was a terrifying, crystal-clear clarity that sharpened everything in the room. If I stayed silent right now, I would never truly exist in this company again. I would be buried alive under the heavy foundation of my own hard work, forever serving as the invisible engine to Preston's shiny exterior. I reached up to my lapel. My fingers found the cold, hard plastic of my employee identification badge. I unclipped it. The small metallic snap sounded impossibly loud to my own ears, though no one else in the self-congratulatory room noticed it. I placed the badge flat on the polished mahogany table. I pushed it with my index finger. It slid a few inches, stopping right next to the sharp edge of the master dossier. I reached out and closed my laptop with a sharp, heavy click. That singular percussive sound finally cut through the thick layer of chatter. A few executive heads turned toward me in mild confusion. Preston glanced over, a tiny, deeply annoyed crease forming between his perfect brows, looking exactly like a wealthy host whose servant had just dropped a loud tray during a formal banquet. I stood up. I pushed my heavy leather chair back, the metal legs scraping harshly and loudly against the low pile carpet. The entire room went completely, instantly dead silent. Mason Pike paused entirely mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open. Warren Bell abruptly dropped his steepled hands to the table. Every single pair of eyes in the glass room was suddenly locked directly onto me. "I resign," I said. My voice was perfectly flat. It did not shake. It carried no obvious anger, no dramatic tears, no desperate plea for delayed recognition. It was simply a cold statement of fact. Effective immediately, Warren blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing slightly in absolute confusion. "Charlie, what in the world are you talking about? Are right in the middle of a critical board meeting. You cannot just leave." I did not let him say another word. I did not look at him, nor did I look at Preston. I simply picked up my laptop and tucked it securely under my left arm. I turned my back on the chief executive officer, the vice president of strategy, the entire board of directors, and the lead investor who held our financial fate. I walked directly toward the heavy glass door. My footsteps were steady and measured on the carpet. I did not look back as I pushed the heavy handle down and opened the door to the hallway. I left them sitting there in the echoing, profoundly stunned silence, staring blankly at the plastic employee badge on the table and the complex blueprint they foolishly thought Preston actually understood. I stepped out of the room, entirely ready to let them drive themselves directly into the devastating storm they had just stolen from me. The utter exhaustion that finally broke me did not begin in that glass boardroom. It was the culmination of exactly 120 days of relentless, punishing labor. For 4 solid months, my entire existence was reduced to grueling shifts lasting 12 to 14 hours a day. I lived on a diet of stale vending machine pretzels, lukewarm black coffee, and the suffocating, heavy dread of an impending corporate collapse. While the executive floor floated in a comfortable, sanitized bubble of high-level summary reports, I was down in the filthy, grinding machinery of the actual business, trying to stop the bleeding. I did not build the rescue model from the comfort of an ergonomic office chair. I flew commercial economy to our most troubled regional hubs. I walked the massive, cracked concrete floors of our distribution centers, my boots echoing in the cavernous spaces that smelled of diesel fuel and desperate overtime. I remember standing in a freezing, poorly lit loading bay in Illinois at 4 a.m, holding a clipboard packed with raw, terrifying operational data. I spoke directly with the line managers, the people whose eyes were permanently bloodshot from trying to meet impossible executive targets. Corporate thinks we can just magically route around the weather delays. A shift supervisor named Marcus had told me, his breath pluming in the freezing air. They do not understand that our secondary transport drivers are legally mandated to rest. The late delivery penalties are eating our operating margins alive. Charlie, we are bleeding out here. I listened to Marcus. I listened to dozens of managers just like him across 5 different states. I took their harsh realities back to my cheap hotel rooms, opened my laptop, and began the agonizing process of combing through our dense, labyrinthine carrier contracts. I hunted down every single hidden penalty clause, every absurd delivery metric that our bloated legal department had blindly approved 3 years prior. I painstakingly cross-referenced the actual, devastating operational costs against the heavily manicured, highly optimistic financial reports that the board of directors was being fed. The disparity was not just a case of gross negligence, it was borderline catastrophic. I built the entire restructuring model from that ugly, unforgiving truth, cell by spreadsheet cell, formula by complex formula. And where exactly was the vice president of strategy during this agonizing, company-saving reconstruction? Preston Bell was exactly where he always was, comfortably detached from anything resembling actual work. If a critical working session was scheduled for 9 a.m, Preston would casually stroll into the conference room at 9:45. He would be holding a ridiculously expensive artisanal latte, his hair perfectly styled, checking his luxury watch with an air of profound self-importance. He would sit at the head of the table, listen to my detailed logistical breakdowns for exactly 10 minutes, nod solemnly with a furrowed brow, and then stand up abruptly. Fanas! Phenomenal groundwork. Team, Preston would say, flashing a polished, entirely hollow smile at the room. I need to jump on a high-priority call with the Capital Investment Group. Keep grinding on the details. Charlie, make sure you send me the high-level executive summary by 5 o'clock so I can review it. He never once looked at the raw data sheets. He never asked how the proposed route consolidations would actually affect our driver retention rates or our warehouse turnaround times. He only cared about the glossy executive summary, the sleek, bullet-pointed slide deck he could ultimately present to his father and the wealthy investors to mathematically prove he was actively managing the crisis. This toxic dynamic was not a sudden development. It was merely the violent climax of a slow, soul-crushing erosion of my professional dignity that had been happening for 2 solid years. Over the past 24 months, I had been forced to watch my intellectual property be systematically stripped away and seamlessly grafted onto Preston's resume. It started small and insidious. I would pitch a complex logistical pivot in a closed-door Tuesday morning huddle. Preston would immediately shoot it down, calling it too risky. Then, on Thursday afternoon, he would present the exact same pivot to the senior directors, confidently swapping the word pivot for strategic realignment and accepting their praise without a flinch. I was the ghostwriter of his entire executive career. I wrote the dense, quarterly risk assessments. In the beginning, my name used to be printed right below the main title. Then, over time, it was quietly moved to the secondary contributors list. Eventually, my name was entirely banished to the tiny, unreadable font at the very bottom of the final page. While Preston Bell's name sat boldly at the top of the document as the sole author and visionary, while the senior leadership team held lavish, multi-course dinners at high-end steakhouses to discuss the future of the company, my inbox remained completely empty. I was strictly forbidden from crossing the invisible velvet rope that separated the people who did the work from the people who took the credit. But a breaking point fundamentally changes a person's psychology. After 2 years of watching my career be casually cannibalized, something inside me turned to pure ice when I began building this final survival model. I knew the financial stakes were too high this time. I knew this specific strategy was the master stroke that would either save Astron Fleet Technologies from bankruptcy or define its corporate autopsy. So, unlike the past 2 years, I did not just work hard. I worked incredibly defensively. I quietly transformed myself into a meticulous digital archivist. Every single time I updated the primary forecasting model, I saved a duplicate file on an encrypted, personal drive, carefully preserving the digital metadata that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was the sole creator, author, and editor. I archived every single dismissive email where Preston delegated the entire workload to me, specifically citing his lack of bandwidth or his need to focus on relationship management. I kept my handwritten meeting notes neatly dated and filed. I securely saved the raw data sheets I had pulled directly from the warehouse servers. I even kept the digital trails of the external drafts I had sent to our independent logistics auditors for verification. I was quietly building a bulletproof, inescapable vault of evidence while they simply assumed I was blindly typing away in the background like a loyal, invisible drone. The definitive, undeniable proof of their malicious intent arrived exactly 1 week before the fateful board presentation. I had finally finished finalizing the master deck. It was a masterpiece of operational triage, designed to stop the financial bleeding and stabilize the core business. But the absolute most important part of that heavy document was the final appendix. In that specific appendix, I had explicitly detailed the absolute, unalterable sequence of the implementation phase. I had clearly stated, in bold text, that closing the massive transit hub in Louisville before fully activating the 2 secondary relief lines would trigger a catastrophic domino effect of severe contract penalties. Furthermore, at the very bottom of that crucial page, I had formally listed myself as the chief architect of the operational model, strictly mandating that any deviation from the precise sequence required my direct, written approval. It was a necessary safety mechanism. It was designed to prevent exactly the kind of reckless, uninformed execution I knew Preston was capable of attempting just to make the quarterly numbers look better for his father. 7 days before the board meeting, I logged into the highly secure shared executive drive to do a final spelling check before printing the massive dossiers. I opened the master file. I scrolled down past the financial projections, past the renegotiation strategies, down to the very end of the document. The appendix was completely gone. It was not accidentally misplaced due to a formatting error. It was surgically, intentionally extracted. The total slide count was noticeably shorter. I immediately checked the internal file history. The digital log showed that the executive assistant from Preston's strategy office had accessed the highly restricted document at 2 a.m, deleted the final 3 pages containing my warnings and my name, and saved it under a finalized version title. They had deliberately stripped away the critical operational warnings, and they had erased my existence completely. They desperately wanted the shiny, company-saving numbers I had produced, but they wanted to completely scrub the woman who calculated them from the historical record so the sun could wear the crown unchallenged. I sat alone in the harsh blue glow of my monitor that night, staring at the screen until my vision blurred and my eyes burned. I did not cry. I did not draft an angry, emotional email demanding an explanation from the executive team. I just felt a cold, heavy realization settle deep into my bones. The naive, hard-working professional who falsely believed that raw merit and loyalty would eventually be recognized had finally died in that office chair. When I gathered my materials and walked toward that glass boardroom 1 week later, my heavy briefcase weighed down with the freshly printed, compromised dossiers. I was not harboring some desperate, pathetic hope that Warren Bell or the investors would suddenly see my true worth. I knew exactly what was going to happen in that room. I knew Preston was going to steal my life's work. I knew his father was going to proudly bless the theft. I walked through those heavy doors with the absolute, chilling certainty that if I sat there and swallowed my pride for 1 more hour, they would cement my burial forever. They were not just stealing a promotion. They were stealing the defining achievement of my career, to prop up a man who could not even comprehend the strategy he was holding. I stepped into that room knowing the fuse was already lit, fully prepared to walk away and let the explosion consume them. The elevator ride down to the main lobby was the quietest descent I had experienced in my entire professional life. Walking out of the heavy glass doors of the corporate headquarters, I stepped into the brisk Columbus afternoon air. The midday traffic hummed along the street, completely indifferent to the seismic shift that had just occurred on the 20th floor. I got into my car and drove back to my apartment. I did not turn on the radio. I did not grip the leather steering wheel in a white-knuckled rage. I did not cry. My heart rate was remarkably steady. Emotion is a rapidly depreciating asset in the corporate world, and I was entirely finished wasting my currency. When people dramatically quit their jobs, the modern, predictable impulse is to immediately broadcast their sudden martyrdom. They log onto professional networking platforms and pen long, vaguely threatening paragraphs about escaping toxic environments and finding their true worth. They aggressively text their former cubicle mates, desperately seeking validation and gossiping about the management team. They go out for expensive drinks and loudly complain to anyone who will listen. I refuse to do any of those predictable, useless things. I put my cellular phone on silent mode, tossed my keys onto the counter, and walked straight to my home office. Vengeance, real vengeance, is not an emotional outburst. It is a mathematical equation. I sat down at my desk, opened my personal laptop, and immediately navigated to my public professional profiles. I did not write a single dramatic word about my sudden departure from Asteron Fleet Technologies. Instead, I simply, surgically updated my career history. I stripped away all the fluffy, meaningless corporate jargon that usually populated those pages and replaced it with cold, hard, unarguable facts. Under my tenure as Director of Operational Strategy, I listed the exact, verified achievements of my labor. I typed out the undeniable reality that I had personally engineered and executed a logistical overhaul that cut 17% of all regional route operating costs. I explicitly noted that I had successfully renegotiated primary vendor contracts, securing complex terms that retained millions of dollars in liquid capital for the fiscal year. Most importantly, I added a highly prominent line stating I was the sole, original architect of the comprehensive, company-wide operational restructuring model designed to reverse 2 consecutive quarters of massive financial hemorrhaging. I built a perfectly clean, terrifyingly sharp portfolio. I claimed exactly what I had done, backing every single bullet point with the measured, verifiable results. I did this so that any competent executive recruiter, any rival chief executive officer, or any sharp-eyed industry analyst looking at my page would instantly see the undeniable truth. They would know exactly who the real mechanic was. I was putting a massive public copyright on my intellectual labor, daring anyone from my former employer to publicly contradict the numbers. Simultaneously, I moved on to my private digital arsenal, I had already been quietly saving my work, but now I needed to organize it for a potential legal or corporate war. I created a heavily encrypted, meticulously structured directory on an external hard drive. I sorted every single piece of evidence chronologically. The first folder held the absolute earliest rough drafts of the recovery plan, proving origin. The second folder contained the raw server metadata, digitally validating my exact keystrokes, creation dates, and login times spanning the entire project timeline. The third folder was a dense collection of internal communications, specifically the emails where upper management had explicitly assigned the logistical overhauls to my department because they lacked the technical capacity to do it themselves. The fourth folder held all the ignored risk warnings I had flagged. Finally, the most vital piece of the puzzle sat in a locked file, the original, unredacted master slide deck, complete with the crucial implementation appendix that Preston's team had so cowardly sliced away before the board meeting. By late afternoon, my cell phone finally began to light up. The caller identification flashed the name of the chief executive officer. I let it ring out. He called again, and then a third time. On the fourth consecutive attempt, I slowly swiped the screen and answered the call, putting the phone on speaker and resting it casually on my desk. "Charlie, this is absolutely ridiculous," Warren Bell barked through the small speaker. His voice was tight, layered with a mixture of forced executive authority and barely concealed panic. "I need you back in this building right now. You are completely overreacting to a standard presentation procedure." I leaned back in my chair. "I am not overreacting. Warren, I am simply removing myself from an equation where my mathematical and strategic value is deliberately ignored. You are taking this far too personally," he insisted, his tone suddenly softening into a patronizing, fatherly cadence that made my stomach turn. Preston was up there representing the team. That is what executives do. "Charlie, they present the collective effort to the board of directors and the investors. Your strategy department did absolutely fantastic work, and we all know that internally. But Preston is the face of the group. He handles the investor relations." I stared at the glowing green light of the active call on my screen. My pulse remained perfectly level. "Warren," I said, my voice cutting through his hollow corporate apologies like a scalpel, "let me ask you one single question. I want you to answer it honestly, right now, on this recorded line." "Fine, ask your question," he snapped, clearly anticipating a demand for a higher salary or a new, meaningless job title. What exact part of that restructuring model did Preston build himself? The silence on the other end of the line was absolute and profoundly heavy. I could almost hear the desperate gears grinding in his head as he searched for a lifeline, a buzzword, anything at all to justify his son's blatant theft. 5 seconds passed, then 10 seconds. "Preston," Warren finally stammered, the authoritative bass completely stripped from his voice, leaving only the weak defense of a nepotistic father. Preston managed the high-level deployment vision. He is the crucial bridge between the raw data and the board's expectations. He provides the leadership role. He did not build a single cell of that model, I stated, shutting down his pathetic attempt at deflection. He does not know what those financial projections mean. He does not know how to actually execute the timeline. And we both know it. Charlie, you need to be reasonable. "Goodbye, Warren," I said, and firmly tapped the red button to end the call. That stammering, pathetic answer from the chief executive officer was the final key turning in the lock. It clarified everything. For years, I had held on to a tiny, naive shred of hope that perhaps the executive suite simply did not realize how much of the heavy lifting I was actually doing. I thought it was just a massive managerial blind spot. But Warren's total inability to name a single actual task his son had completed proved the terrifying reality. The company had not made an administrative mistake. They were not simply confused about who wrote the strategy. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they had calculated that I lacked the spine to ever challenge their authority. They assumed I would just swallow the disrespect, sleep it off, and quietly return to my desk on Monday morning to fix the inevitable, catastrophic mistakes Preston was bound to make. They were entirely wrong. Before the sun even set that evening, I logged onto the state registry website. I filled out the necessary legal paperwork, paid the expedited registration fees, and formally incorporated my own independent consulting firm. I named it Mendoza Operational Advisory. I did not rent a fancy commercial office space or hire a bloated marketing team. I only needed my laptop, my raw data, and my flawless track record. Sitting there in the quiet of my home, I made a silent, ironclad vow. I was completely done waiting for wealthy men in tailored suits to politely acknowledge my existence. I was done begging for a seat at a table that I had personally built from scratch. This time, I was not going to ask anyone to see me. I was going to let the cold, unforgiving reality of the open market force them to look. I was going to let their stolen, deeply misunderstood strategy inevitably collapse under its own heavy weight. And when they finally realized they were drowning in their own incompetence, I would be the only person on earth holding the life raft. This time, I would force them to face the absolute truth through undeniable data, and I would be the one setting the exact, exorbitant price for their survival. Exactly 21 days. That was all the time it took for the brittle, highly polished facade of executive competence at Asteron Fleet Technologies to completely shatter into pieces. Without my hand violently gripping the steering wheel, Preston Bell decided to execute the complex restructuring plan according to his own shallow, purely cosmetic interpretation. With the end of the fiscal quarter rapidly approaching, he desperately needed a massive, headline-grabbing reduction in overhead to justify the board of directors' blind faith in his leadership. He looked at the operational map, pointed a manicured finger at our massive logistics hub in Louisville, Kentucky, and ordered an immediate, total shutdown. It was the strategic equivalent of yanking the concrete foundation out from under a towering skyscraper just to save a few dollars on the ground floor. In the intricate, highly sensitive mathematical model I had painstakingly built, closing the Louisville terminal was strictly, immovably slated for the 9th week of the rollout phase. That specific timeline existed because the closure absolutely required the prior, full activation of 2 critical, secondary relief lines running through Indiana and Tennessee. The system needed a bypass before you could sever the main artery. Preston completely ignored the sequencing. He did not understand the structural load. He just wanted the instant cash savings to appear on the quarterly balance sheet. The moment the massive steel bay doors in Louisville locked, the entire regional supply chain violently buckled. Thousands of tons of freight suddenly had nowhere to go. Tractor trailers were abruptly rerouted in mid-transit to smaller facilities that completely lacked the square footage, the docking bays, or the manpower to receive them. Delivery times instantly skyrocketed from a standard 48 hours to a disastrous 96 hours, and in several rural sectors, the delays stretched well over 120 hours. Trucks sat idling in unseasonably warm weather, causing refrigeration fuel costs to triple in a matter of days, and with those massive delays came the automated triggers. I had spent weeks mapping out the brutal penalty clauses hidden deep within our major freight carrier contracts. By the 3rd week of Preston's reckless leadership, those automated fines woke up like starving wolves, aggressively biting into the company's rapidly shrinking cash reserves for every single late or redirected shipment. The catastrophe did not stop at the loading docks. A major indispensable parts supplier based in Michigan went absolutely ballistic on a Tuesday morning. Preston's newly formed strategy team, eager to trim the fat and prove their worth, had abruptly terminated a massive procurement contract for fleet maintenance. They entirely missed the heavily fortified 30-day written notice clause that I had practically bathed in fluorescent yellow highlighter in the original internal documents. I had clearly marked that specific vendor relationship as strictly off-limits for early termination, due to our heavy reliance on their specialized inventory. The supplier immediately retaliated by freezing all inbound shipments of replacement axles, heavy-duty tires, and brake pads. This retaliatory strike brought our internal maintenance fleet to a grinding, terrifying halt, while their legal team simultaneously prepared a multi-million-dollar breach of contract lawsuit. Down in the trenches, The regional operations directors were in a state of absolute, unmitigated panic. These were the seasoned veterans actually moving the metal across the highways, and they were watching their networks collapse in real time. They started calling the executive floor relentlessly, begging for actionable solutions. They were holding up the beautifully formatted, glossy slide decks Preston had distributed and screaming into their telephones that the neat bullet points did not explain how to unfreeze a massive gridlock of perishable goods rotting on Interstate 65. The smart-looking strategy that had earned Preston a standing ovation was utterly, comically useless in the dirt, diesel, and chaos of the real world. It was a beautiful map drawn by a man who had never actually walked the treacherous terrain. Up in the sterile, soundproofed finance department, the frantic accountants were desperately trying to build a dam to hold back the floodwaters, under immense, suffocating pressure from Warren Bell to maintain the illusion of absolute control. The finance team attempted to mask the catastrophic weekly operational losses. They started clumping the daily deficit numbers into rolling, obscure monthly averages, desperately trying to smooth out the terrifying spikes in operating costs before the major investors noticed the bleeding. But capital investment firms do not survive by being gullible or looking the other way. Mason Pike's team of ruthless quantitative analysts expected to see a sharp 10% reduction in operating expenditures by the end of the first 30 days. Instead, their external monitoring software was flagging a totally stalled logistics network, soaring fuel costs, and an alarming, unprecedented spike in carrier contract penalties. The promised financial milestones were not just being missed, they were rapidly moving in the exact opposite direction. The glorious narrative Preston had sold them was actively unraveling in real time, and the numbers were screaming that something was fundamentally broken at the core of the company. The most dangerous realization, however, was happening quietly inside the private home office of Naomi Voss. Naomi was an independent board member, a seasoned veteran of corporate turnarounds, and a woman who possessed a lethal, unforgiving attention to detail. Disturbed by the sudden, chaotic operational reports crossing her desk, she sat down and opened her highly secure email server. She dug through her archives and pulled up the preliminary prep meeting documents she had received several weeks before the infamous boardroom presentation. She placed her digital tablet next to the final, freshly printed dossier Preston had handed out during the meeting. She began reading them side by side, line by line. The discrepancy was not just minor, it was glaringly obvious. The preliminary file, the one possessing my invisible digital fingerprints, contained a rigid, complex, and deeply logical mathematical architecture. It accounted for unpredictable variables, seasonal weather patterns, and strict union labor laws. The final version, the one Preston proudly claimed as his ultimate vision, felt remarkably hollow by comparison. It was entirely stripped of its vital organs. It lacked the crucial warning appendix. Naomi slowly realized she was looking at two entirely different operational languages. She was looking at the undeniable, written evidence that the confident man standing at the podium was absolutely not the brilliant architect who drew the blueprints. Inside the sprawling Astron headquarters, the people who actually mattered began to whisper. The mid-level managers, the shift supervisors, and the logistics coordinators watched the executive suite scramble from one frantic emergency meeting to the next. They saw Preston Bell pacing the glass hallways, his perfectly tailored navy suits suddenly looking a little too tight, his confident, rehearsed smile completely replaced by a tight, panicked grimace. They are trying to fly a massive commercial airliner through a hurricane, and no one in the cockpit knows what any of the buttons actually do. One of my former senior data analysts texted me late one night. I read the message while sitting comfortably in the quiet of my living room, sipping a glass of water. I did not reply to him. I did not need to fan the flames. The fire was doing a spectacular job all on its own. The very next morning, my newly established professional corporate email account registered a secure notification. It was a highly discreet, carefully worded message directly from a senior partner at Mason Pike's venture fund. It was politely disguised as a standard industry inquiry about the services offered by my new independent consulting firm, But the underlying subtext was screaming loudly. They were quietly fishing for information. They desperately wanted to know why the incredibly sharp, foolproof strategy they had just bet hundreds of millions of dollars on was suddenly tearing their investment apart from the inside. I closed my laptop screen, a slow, deep sense of profound satisfaction warming my chest. The story was nowhere near over. The boardroom theft was merely the prologue to the disaster. The real, devastating drama was just beginning to crack wide open from the inside out, and gravity was doing exactly what I knew it would do. The empire was falling, and I was the only person holding the net. The encrypted messaging application on my personal phone chimed at exactly 9 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. The sender was an unregistered number, but the text contained a private access code to a highly secure audio bridge. I recognized the numeric formatting immediately. It was the exact protocol used by the elite tier of venture capital firms when they needed to completely bypass corporate servers and legally monitored communication channels. I typed in the passcodes and dialed in. "Charlie?" Mason Pike's gravelly voice came through the encrypted line. He sounded deeply fatigued, yet intensely sharp. "I appreciate you taking the call at this hour. I am always available for a consultation." "Mason," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral and carefully measured. "This is not a casual consultation," he said, the exhaustion briefly giving way to a cold, predatory edge. "This is a forensic post-mortem on a train wreck. I need you to know something right now." During that final boardroom presentation, the very moment Preston opened his mouth and started advancing the slides, my instincts were screaming that he was reciting a foreign language. He had the smooth, practiced cadence of a professional salesman, but he completely lacked the underlying friction of someone who had actually wrestled with the heavy mathematics. He was floating above the details, totally unburdened by the gravity of the actual execution. Mason paused, the heavy silence stretching over the secure line. I could hear the faint clinking of ice against crystal in the background. "I still have the preliminary exit strategy draft you sent to my private office exactly 6 weeks ago," Mason continued. "The one you sent requesting my direct feedback on the regional withdrawal timeline. I had my internal forensic technology team pull the file history yesterday afternoon. The digital metadata is absolute and undeniable. Your digital signature is permanently embedded in every single cell, every complex macro, and every pivot table. Preston's name does not exist anywhere in the foundational architecture." I did not interrupt him. I let him lay his powerful cards, face up on the table. "Naomi Voss also reached out to me quietly this morning," Mason said, lowering his voice as if someone might be listening outside his own heavily guarded doors. "She was deeply suspicious of the chaotic operational report she was receiving. She dug through the raw, unedited archives from the board portal. She found the missing appendix. She found the 3 mandatory execution conditions that were mysteriously absent from Preston's final deck. And most importantly, she found the massive red flag you raised regarding vendor termination." That was the exact moment the scattered, seemingly unrelated puzzle pieces abruptly snapped together in my mind, forming a picture far more sinister than simple executive plagiarism. I opened my encrypted drive while Mason was still speaking. Pulling up my original, unredacted slide deck, I navigated straight to the final, deleted appendix. There it was, the 3rd bullet point under vendor consolidation. The specific supplier I had explicitly marked for immediate, non-negotiable termination, Harbor Ark Transit. "Harbor Ark," I whispered to the empty room, the realization hitting me like a physical blow to the chest. "Exactly," Mason confirmed, his voice devoid of any warmth. It was never just about Preston's fragile ego. It was not merely a desperate, incompetent son trying to steal a brilliant strategy to secure a promotion and impress his father. It was a calculated, high-stakes financial cover-up. Harbor Ark. Transit was not just another underperforming logistics contractor dragging down our margins. They were deeply historically embedded in Warren Bell's personal network. The chief executive officer of Harbor Ark was a permanent fixture at Warren's private country club, a frequent weekend guest at his summer estate, and a quiet, highly leveraged co-investor in several of the Bell family's private real estate ventures across the state. In my purely mathematical, ruthless pursuit of operational efficiency, I had accurately identified Harbor Ark as a massive bleeding wound in our supply chain. Their hauling rates were 25% higher than the current industry standard. Their delivery failure rate was hovering dangerously around 12%. My mathematical model mandated severing their contract completely to free up millions of dollars in liquid capital. Preston did not just delete my name from the title page to claim the intellectual glory. He and his father deliberately deleted the appendix to protect their lucrative, highly unethical political alliance. They intentionally kept a toxic, rotting vendor attached to the company's financial arteries because the Bell family prioritized their private country club relationships over the actual survival of Asteron Fleet Technologies. But by keeping Harbor Ark active, they had fundamentally corrupted the entire cost-saving equation. My model was a tightly wound, highly calibrated clock. If you refused to remove the broken, jagged gear, the entire mechanism would inevitably tear itself to shreds. That was exactly why the regional operations were currently spiraling into absolute chaos. They were desperately trying to achieve my aggressive financial savings targets, while simultaneously carrying the massive, dead weight of Warren Bell's blatant cronyism. It was mathematically and physically impossible. They sabotaged the life raft before it even hit the water, I said, my eyes rapidly tracking the damning numbers on my glowing monitor. It gets significantly worse, Charlie, Mason said, his tone shifting from investigative to purely lethal. That massive emergency refinancing package we just authorized. The massive capital injection designed to keep the company lights on for the next 18 months. That entire binding agreement was underwritten based strictly on the financial projections and the precise rollout milestones detailed in your specific model. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The implications were absolutely staggering. In the unforgiving world of high-level corporate finance, securing venture capital under false pretenses is not just a strategic miscalculation. It is a fatal, potentially criminal violation. If the board of directors formally determines that there was a deliberate misrepresentation of the core strategic assumptions, Mason explained, every single word deliberately measured and heavy with consequence, or a fraudulent presentation regarding the true author and architect of the recovery plan, it constitutes a massive breach of our financial covenants, which means your firm has the legal authority to trigger an executive sweep, I stated, the brutal legal terminology tasting like sharp iron on my tongue. Exactly, Mason replied. We can legally force an immediate, non-negotiable change in the executive management structure. We can clear out the entire suite, starting with Warren and ending with Preston. But I cannot pull that trigger based on hushed whispers and scattered metadata alone. I need the architect. I need the singular person who can step into a hostile room, tear their corrupted rollout apart piece by bloody piece, and mathematically prove exactly how the deception was engineered to protect private interests. The call ended shortly after, leaving me sitting in the quiet hum of my home office. The glow of the monitor cast long, sharp shadows across my polished desk. For the past 3 weeks, I had viewed this entire ordeal through the narrow, personal lens of professional justice. I thought I was simply fighting to reclaim my stolen intellectual property and expose a spoiled, grossly incompetent vice president. I believed my ultimate, final victory would be watching them publicly squirm and admit they desperately needed my brain to fix their mess. But the shocking revelation about Harbor Ark Transit and the venture capital covenants shifted the entire tectonic plate of the conflict. This was no longer a simple workplace grievance about stolen credit. This was a massive structural vulnerability at the very top of the corporate hierarchy. Warren Bell had intentionally compromised his fiduciary duty to protect his personal wealth network, and he had used his son's fake, glossy presentation to blindfold the investors while he executed the theft. I looked at the organized files on my screen, the original, untampered draft, the maliciously deleted appendix, the bloated, toxic contract history of Harbor Ark Transit, the massive, rigid refinancing terms provided by Mason's firm, The Bell family thought they had simply silenced an annoying middle management strategist who was getting too ambitious. They had absolutely no idea they had accidentally handed me the master key to their entire kingdom. I did not just possess the ability to demand a public apology or aggressively negotiate a lucrative consulting fee. I was holding the exact, heavy, unyielding lever required to permanently dismantle their dynasty. I could strip Warren of his coveted crown, banish Preston to the absolute fringes of the industry, and take total, undisputed control of the wreckage. The stakes had escalated overnight from mere vindication to total corporate annihilation. I closed the encrypted drive, a dangerous, absolute calm settling over my mind. I was no longer just waiting for them to fail on their own. I was methodically preparing to be their executioner. The phone rang at 11:15 on a Thursday night. I was sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing the initial incorporation documents for my new firm. I glanced at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed Warren Bell. I let it ring 4 times before I finally picked it up. I did not say a single word. I simply breathed into the receiver and waited for him to cross the bridge. "Charlie," Warren said. His voice was remarkably different from our last conversation. The booming, authoritative baritone had completely evaporated, replaced by a thin, gravelly rasp that spoke of sleepless nights and unrelenting stress. He paused heavily. I let the silence stretch out, forcing him to endure every agonizing second of his own desperation. "We are experiencing some unexpected friction with the rollout phase," he finally managed to say, clinging desperately to his hollow corporate vocabulary. "The implementation is facing some severe operational headwinds. The board feels we could benefit from your granular expertise to help support the transition." Friction, headwinds, support. It was almost comical how he refused to use the word failure. I did not interrupt him. I let him stumble through a few more painful sentences about supply chain bottlenecks, vendor miscommunications, and unforeseen logistical gridlocks. I listened to the heavy, labored breathing between his words. He was bleeding out, and he was trying to ask for a bandage without admitting he had been stabbed. He wanted to pretend this was just a minor course correction, a small favor from a former loyal employee. "I am not an employee of your company anymore, Warren," I said, my voice perfectly level, cold, and entirely devoid of any sympathetic warmth. "I am the managing director of Mendoza Operational Advisory. If you are calling to retain my firm's services, we can discuss a contract. But you are absolutely not bringing me back to quietly fix a mess in the background while your son continues to smile for the cameras." "Fine," Warren conceded quickly, a sharp exhale hitting the phone's microphone. "Whatever title you need to feel comfortable, just come in tomorrow morning and look at the logistics network. We need to stabilize the Midwestern routes. My title is independent consultant," I corrected him. "And my terms are strict and non-negotiable. First, my consulting fee is exactly 3 times my former annual executive salary, prorated for the duration of the contract. I require a 30% non-refundable retainer wired into my corporate account before I even step foot inside your building. Furthermore, I require absolute, unrestricted administrative access to all real-time operational and financial data. No redacted files, no restricted folders." Warren let out a choked, desperate gasp. 3 times. "Charlie, that is an exorbitant figure. I cannot possibly justify that kind of massive expense to the finance committee right now. We are bleeding cash." "Then you can explain to the finance committee why your entire freight network is paralyzed and your primary vendors are actively preparing massive breach of contract lawsuits," I replied coldly. "My second condition, I will no longer report to the executive suite. I report exclusively and directly to the board of directors and the primary capital investment group. There will be absolutely no family filter between my data findings and the people who actually hold the purse strings of this company." "You are asking me to completely bypass my own authority," he said, his voice trembling with a chaotic mixture of defensive rage and sheer panic. "I am requiring you to remove yourself from the blast radius," I corrected. "Third condition, every single piece of strategic documentation, both historical and moving forward, will carry my name as the sole architect. The days of my authorship being shrunk, deleted, or reassigned to a vice president are permanently over. It will be explicitly stated in writing across all formal company records. I want my name restored to the master deck. The silence on the line was profound and heavy. I knew he was physically gripping his desk in the dark, trapped hopelessly between his massive, fragile ego and the terrifying, rapidly approaching reality of bankruptcy. And the fourth condition, I continued, driving the final lethal nail into the coffin with absolute precision. Preston Bell is strictly forbidden from attending any technical meetings, war rooms, or strategy sessions that I lead. Furthermore, he is immediately stripped of all decision-making authority regarding the implementation of the recovery model until the board completes a full, independent review of the current crisis. "You cannot banish my son from his own department," Warren snapped, a sudden, desperate flare of parental defense rising in his throat. "That is public humiliation. You are asking me to castrate him in front of the entire company. It is operational triage," I said sharply, my tone cutting through his emotional defense like a razor. "He is actively crashing the plane. I am taking away his pilot license so I can pull us out of the nosedive. You can either accept these terms right now, or you can call Mason Pike in the morning and tell him you deliberately chose your son's fragile pride over his massive financial investment." I knew exactly why I could push that specific, dangerous button so ruthlessly. Behind the scenes, Naomi Voss and Mason Pike had already cornered Warren. They understood perfectly well that Astron Fleet Technologies had completely run out of time to protect the Bell family legacy. Mason had likely threatened to pull the entire emergency refinancing package if Warren did not secure my return immediately. They had handed Warren the loaded gun and forced him to make the call. He had zero leverage, and we both knew it. "Send the contract to the legal department," Warren whispered, his voice completely defeated, drained of all its former power. The line went dead. I spent the next 2 hours drafting the most ironclad, merciless consulting agreement my legal software could possibly generate. I detailed the exact compensation figures in bold text, outlined the explicit reporting structure, and cemented the strict operational boundaries regarding Preston. I emailed the document directly to the chief legal counsel of Astron, making absolutely sure to copy both Mason Pike and Naomi Voss. By 8 o'clock the following morning, the contract was signed, digitally verified, and the massive retainer fee had successfully cleared into my new corporate bank account. At 9 o'clock sharp, I pulled my car into the executive parking garage of the Astron headquarters. I did not park in my old, cramped, assigned spot on the 3rd level. I parked in the designated visitor spaces right near the private, glass elevator, a physical manifestation of my new, elevated status. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the main lobby. The security guard at the front desk, a man who had known me for years, looked up with wide, shocked eyes. I did not have a plastic employee badge to swipe. He quickly checked his daily log, swallowed hard, and hurriedly printed a premium contractor pass. The elevator ride up to the 20th floor felt entirely different this time. Weeks ago, I had descended these very same shafts feeling like a ghost, an invisible, disposable asset whose life's work had been violently hijacked. Now, the heavy metal doors parted to reveal a totally transformed atmosphere. The executive floor was practically humming with a thick, suffocating nervous energy. Assistants darted quickly through the hallways carrying thick stacks of paper. Senior managers stood in hushed, frantic clusters near the coffee stations, their faces pale with exhaustion. The moment I stepped onto the carpet, the conversations abruptly died. Heads turned, eyes followed me. I walked past my old, small cubicle without a single sideways glance. I walked directly past the closed, frosted glass door of the Vice President of Strategy. I did not look for Preston. I did not care if he was hiding inside his luxurious office, stewing in his own bitter humiliation. I was directed by a nervous assistant to a massive, private corner office that had been hastily cleared out for my arrival. It had a sweeping view of the city, a massive mahogany desk, and a private conference table. I placed my heavy leather briefcase onto the polished wood. I opened it and pulled out my laptop. I did not return to this building as a wounded, desperate employee begging for a second chance or quietly asking for a slightly better performance review. I returned as an apex predator. I was the absolute only person within a 100-mile radius who possessed the intricate living map required to navigate them out of the devastating hurricane they had foolishly triggered. They had treated me like a compliant, invisible servant, and in doing so, they had accidentally handed me the master keys to the entire kingdom. Now, I owned the locks. I set the exact, exorbitant price of admission, and they were going to pay every single cent. The air in the boardroom was completely different this time. I stood at the exact spot where Preston had stood 20-something days ago. But the energy in the room had shifted from blind, self-congratulatory warmth to a tense, suffocating panic. I did not begin my presentation with personal grievances, passive-aggressive remarks, or emotional accusations regarding my stolen credit. I opened with a brutal, clinical autopsy of the company's current massive hemorrhage. When you sever a primary arterial route without establishing the necessary bypass, the system does not simply slow down, it aggressively suffocates, I stated, my voice echoing off the glass walls. I clicked my presentation remote, bringing up a live, real-time heat map of the Midwestern freight network. The massive projector screen flared with angry, expanding red clusters. By prematurely shutting down the Louisville facility in Week 2, rather than the strictly mandated Week 9, you triggered a catastrophic cascading failure across 5 separate states. Regional delivery times jumped from an acceptable average of 48 hours to well over 100 hours. This single, uninformed decision immediately activated aggressive penalty clauses in our 3 largest vendor contracts, bleeding roughly $2 million in operational fines in just 14 days. The board members stared at the screen, their faces pale in the glow of the projector. I did not pause to let them mourn the lost capital. I invited their questions, and they came like rapid fire from every corner of the long mahogany table. An executive from the Risk Management Division asked about the specific routing logic for the hazardous materials sector. I answered him immediately without looking down at my notes, citing the exact federal compliance codes and the specific detour mileage required to avoid restricted residential zones. Another board member, deeply concerned about the balance sheet, asked about the compounding interest on the delayed freight fines. I gave her the exact mathematical formula, breaking down the daily accrual rate down to the single cent. The contrast in the room was palpable and absolute. They were finally experiencing the vast, unbridgeable chasm between a man who merely recited memorized, high-level bullet points and the actual engineer who forged the heavy machinery. A distinguished man sitting near the center of the table, a senior partner from one of the institutional funds, leaned forward. He steepled his fingers, his eyes locking onto mine with a sudden, sharp intensity. "Miss Mendoza," he began, his tone heavy with a terrifying realization. "Considering the staggering depth of your granular knowledge, I have a very direct question. Who exactly built the foundational architecture of this recovery model?" This was the precise moment. The trap they had so arrogantly built for me was about to snap shut directly on their own necks. "I am incredibly glad you asked," I replied, my voice remaining perfectly steady and cold. I tapped a key on my laptop. The chaotic red heat map of the failing supply chain vanished, instantly replaced by a stark, black-and-white digital ledger. It was the raw, unedited metadata log pulled directly from the secure corporate servers. "What you are looking at is the complete digital forensic history of the restructuring project," I explained, using a red laser pointer to guide their eyes down the massive, dense column of data. This timeline spans exactly 4 months. Over that excruciating period, the master strategic file was opened, edited, and saved exactly 412 times. Next to every single one of those saves is my personal user identification code. You will see the timestamps often running past 2 in the morning. You will see the heavy data pulls originating exclusively from my secure terminal. My digital fingerprints are permanently embedded in every single macro algorithm and pivot table. I let that sink in, watching their eyes rapidly scan the undeniable mathematical proof of my labor. Then, I clicked the remote one more time. A second, drastically shorter column appeared on the right side of the massive screen. "This is the digital footprint of your Vice President of Strategy," I said cleanly, letting the title drip with quiet disdain. "You will notice there are exactly 0 edits, 0 data contributions, 0 structural formatting. The only recorded activity associated with his account is a single, read-only access log, registered less than 24 hours before he stood in this exact room and presented my work to you as his own original vision." A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the polished boardroom. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs, but I was not finished. Exposing the blatant plagiarism was only the appetizer. The main course was the intentional, malicious sabotage. "However," I continued, the temperature in my voice dropping to freezing, "taking unearned credit is merely an issue of profound executive ego. What happened next is a matter of catastrophic operational negligence." I brought up the final slide of my original presentation, the one the board had never been allowed to see. "This is Appendix Section 4, which was surgically deleted from your final presentation packets. In this specific section, I established 3 absolute non-negotiable prerequisites for the restructuring phase. First, I explicitly stated that the Louisville hub could absolutely not be closed until the Indiana and Tennessee relief lines were fully staffed, tested, and operational." Several board members audibly gasped, instantly connecting the maliciously deleted warning to the massive financial bleeding they were currently experiencing on the ground. Furthermore, I pushed forward, driving the blade deeper. I placed a strict, unavoidable red flag on one specific logistics vendor, Harbor Arc Transit. My raw data definitively proved their hauling rates were 25% above the market average, coupled with a completely unacceptable failure rate. My mathematical model dictated their immediate total termination to salvage our operating margins. I turned my gaze directly to the head of the table. Warren Bell was gripping the armrests of his heavy chair so tightly his knuckles were completely white. A thick sheen of cold sweat had broken out across his forehead. His carefully constructed dynastic empire was being ruthlessly dismantled piece by piece under the bright fluorescent lighting. "The deletion of this appendix was not a simple clerical error," I stated, letting the heavy words hang in the dead air. "It was a deliberate, calculated erasure of critical operational warnings, executed specifically to protect a private, deeply inefficient vendor relationship at the direct expense of this company's ultimate survival. You were sold a map that had the cliff edges intentionally erased, so you would not see who was profiting from the fall." The silence that followed was so absolute, you could hear the faint, mechanical hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. No one looked at Warren. The collective realization hit the investors and the board simultaneously. The chief executive officer's son was not just painfully incompetent and lazy. He, or someone acting under his direct administrative orders, had actively sabotaged the only viable lifeline the company had left, simply to protect his family's lucrative private country club connections. The flawless rescue plan they had staked hundreds of millions of dollars on was intentionally corrupted from the inside. Naomi Voss was the first person to break the severe paralysis. She sat up entirely straight, adjusting her glasses with a sharp, decisive movement. She did not look angry. She looked like a Supreme Court judge about to deliver a fatal, unappealable sentence. "Given the extreme severity of these forensic revelations," Naomi announced, her voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable authority that commanded the entire room, "I am immediately motioning for the formation of a special independent review committee. This committee will launch a full, unhindered investigation into the file access logs, the explicit, fraudulent misattribution of strategic credit, and the profound, highly damaging conflicts of interest surrounding the Harbor Arc Transit vendor relationship. I expect complete, total compliance from the executive suite." Warren slowly opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer some pathetic, desperate defense of his son, or perhaps to weakly frame the missing pages as an unfortunate administrative oversight. But he looked around at the hardened, furious faces of the investors and realized there was absolutely no cover left to hide behind. The raw numbers do not lie, and the raw numbers were currently strangling his legacy to death. He slowly closed his mouth and stared blankly at the polished wood in front of him, looking suddenly very frail, very old, and entirely defeated. He finally understood that his son's arrogant theft had likely just cost them both their entire corporate kingdom. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply reached over to my laptop and closed the forensic log on my screen. The emotional execution was complete. The rot had been successfully diagnosed in broad daylight, and the point was irreparably made. The independent investigation can handle the corporate accountability, I said, my tone shifting instantly from a cold prosecutor to a pragmatic chief surgeon. I brought up a brand new, highly complex structural recovery diagram on the main projector. My sole focus right now is stopping the financial bleeding. We are currently losing roughly $150,000 a day in entirely preventable logistical bottlenecks. If you want this company to actually survive until the end of the fiscal year, this is exactly how we are going to fix the broken machine before it tears itself completely apart. I watched the entire room visibly shift their posture, leaning forward toward the glowing screen, entirely captivated by the only person left in the building who could actually save them. I commandeered a massive, windowless conference room on the 4th floor of the headquarters and permanently rebranded it as the operational war room. I banned glossy presentations entirely. If any manager walked through those heavy doors holding a color-coded executive summary or a beautifully animated slide deck, I immediately sent them back to their desks. I demanded raw, unformatted, and entirely unforgiving spreadsheets. I needed the ugly, bleeding truth, unfiltered by the protective layers of middle management. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning at 6 o'clock sharp, I mandated strict attendance from the regional operations directors, the warehouse shift supervisors, the procurement heads, and the lead accountants. We stripped the polite corporate veneer away and began aggressively scrubbing the wounds of the company. My first executive mandate was an immediate, forceful reversal of the deployment sequence. I essentially pulled the emergency brake on Preston's disastrous, vanity-driven rollout. We could not magically unlock the massive Louisville hub. The physical locks had already been changed, and the local staff had been abruptly severed, but I could aggressively staunch the massive arterial bleeding. Within the first 72 hours of my return, I authorized the rapid temporary lease of a secondary transit facility located just across the state line in southern Indiana. It was an ugly, outdated, and heavily rusted warehouse, but it possessed the physical docking bays we desperately needed to absorb the massive freight overflow. Simultaneously, I personally spent 3 straight days locked in my office on the phone with the hostile legal representatives of our 2 largest freight carriers. By aggressively leveraging our historical shipping volume data and offering highly specific, guaranteed minimums for the next fiscal year, I successfully renegotiated the brutal late penalty clauses. I managed to claw back nearly $400,000 in operational fines that had been blindly accepted during the previous 3 weeks. By the end of my first 30 days back inside the building, the terrifying financial hemorrhage had slowed from a lethal gush to a highly manageable trickle. But saving a dying patient is incredibly difficult when several of the attending doctors actively want the patient to expire on the operating table. The executive suite and the upper management tiers were still heavily populated by men who owed their lucrative careers directly to Warren Bell and his son. For these mid-level loyalists, my sudden return, my absolute authority, and my undeniable competence represented a massive, existential threat to their comfortable ecosystem. If I successfully stabilized the logistics network using my original, uncorrupted methodology, the carefully constructed narrative of the young, brilliant prince saving the company would be completely and permanently obliterated. So, they began to fight back using the only weapon they actually understood cowardly: anonymous corporate sabotage. A deputy director of finance, a man who regularly played golf with Preston on Sunday mornings and desperately wanted a promotion to the senior suite, began leaking selective financial data to the internal corporate gossip mill. He quietly planted the malicious narrative that I was ruthlessly profiteering from the company's desperate crisis. He highlighted my heavily multiplied consulting fee to the staff, whispering in the break rooms that my aggressive contract demands were actively draining the exact liquid capital the company needed to survive the quarter. He desperately wanted the rank-and-file employees to view me not as their savior, but as a greedy mercenary picking the bones of a dying giant. I did not engage in the petty, emotional office politics. I did not storm into his office, slam the door, and demand a loud retraction. I responded with absolute, suffocating, and terrifying mathematical transparency. At the end of that specific week, I compiled a highly detailed, globally distributed financial brief and sent it to every single managerial inbox in the company. I proudly listed my exact, prorated consulting fee right at the very top of the first page. Right below it, in bold black ink, I listed the exact mathematically verified amount of capital I had saved the company that specific week through renegotiated carrier penalties, optimized fuel routing, and canceled redundant vendor orders. The numbers were undeniable. For every single dollar Astron Fleet Technologies paid to my firm, I was actively returning $40 back to their starving balance sheet. The vicious rumors evaporated overnight. The numbers were a brutal, blinding light that scattered the political roaches back into the dark corners of the building, down on the actual operational floor. The atmosphere underwent a massive, profound shift. The hardened logistics managers, the men and women who actually loaded the heavy trucks and managed the chaotic dispatch boards, began to openly and aggressively rally behind my directives. For the first time in over 24 months, they were receiving marching orders that actually reflected the physical reality of their daily struggles. I was not making strategic decisions based on whose father owned a private equity firm or which vendor bought the best steak dinners. I was making decisions based on legal axle weight limits, mandatory driver rest periods, and localized Midwestern weather patterns. When I issued a command, they executed it with absolute precision because they finally trusted the architect holding the blueprint. As the operational metrics slowly began to turn from a terrifying crimson to a stable green, the panic inside the Bell family estate must have reached an absolute boiling point. Late on a Friday evening, exactly 1 month into my hostile takeover of the strategy department, my personal cellular phone vibrated on my nightstand. The illuminated screen displayed a direct text message from Preston Bell. It was a pathetic, thinly veiled attempt to assert dominance from a man who had absolutely none left in his arsenal. "Charlie," the glowing message read, "I know tensions have been incredibly high lately, but we have to remember we are all on the same team here. Let us find a way to resolve this entire situation in a civilized manner before things get completely out of hand. Pushing the Bell family into a corner is not a strategic long-term career move for anyone in this industry. Let us grab a quiet coffee this weekend and smooth this over." It was the classic, cowardly maneuver of a cornered bully trying to reframe his sheer incompetence and theft as a minor personal misunderstanding. He was dangling a vague, implied threat regarding his powerful family's industry connections, desperately hoping to intimidate me into softening my grip on the Operational Review Committee. He wanted me to back down, to magically grant him a sliver of the credit so he could salvage his completely destroyed reputation before the board brought the hammer down. I did not type a reply. I did not laugh, nor did I feel a single ounce of righteous anger. I simply took a high-resolution digital screenshot of the text message. I opened my secure corporate email client and attached the image to a new, heavily encrypted message. I addressed the email directly to Iris Kellen, the formidable internal legal counsel and the newly appointed head of the board's independent review committee. I added a single, factual sentence to the body of the email. "Please add this documented attempt at external intimidation and witness tampering to the ongoing investigation files regarding the Vice President of Strategy." I hit send, instantly transforming his desperate, emotional manipulation into a permanent, highly damaging piece of legal evidence that would sit perfectly in his rapidly expanding disciplinary file. By the end of the 6th week, the initial quarter-end financial reports were quietly circulated to the primary investors. The staggering corporate freefall had not only been completely halted, but the core logistics network was actually beginning to show a fractional, yet undeniable, margin of profit. Sitting in their opulent, high-rise offices, Naomi Voss, Mason Pike, and the rest of the board of directors finally understood the sheer, terrifying magnitude of their near-fatal mistake. The most frightening aspect of this entire ordeal was not that I had angrily walked out of the glass boardroom weeks ago. The truly terrifying realization that kept the investors awake at night was the fact that they had genuinely, foolishly believed they could replace my ruthless, granular operational genius with a famous surname, a tailored suit, and a confident, empty smile. The inevitable counterattack did not come from the boardroom. It came from the legal department. When an animal is backed into a corner with no viable escape route, it usually resorts to blind, thrashing aggression. Preston Bell was out of operational maneuvers, so he decided to play his final, desperate political card. On a dreary Tuesday morning, exactly 8 weeks into my hostile operational takeover, I received a formal, highly sterile email from Iris Kellen. The subject line indicated an urgent compliance review. When I walked into her secure office on the 19th floor, I found Preston sitting rigidly in a leather chair. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. Sitting beside him was a junior partner from an external litigation firm. "Miss Mendoza," the external lawyer began, his tone dripping with practiced corporate menace. "We have reason to believe that upon your sudden resignation, you unlawfully downloaded highly confidential proprietary logistical data belonging to Asteron Fleet Technologies. My client, the Vice President of Strategy, asserts that you utilized this stolen intellectual property to illegally construct the foundation of your new private consulting firm." It was a classic, heavy-handed intimidation tactic. Preston was trying to bury me in a massive, financially crippling lawsuit to force a settlement where I would quietly drop the internal investigation against him. He wanted to frame my meticulously built portfolio as the product of corporate espionage rather than undeniable personal competence. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or launch into a defensive tirade. I simply looked at Iris Kellen, the head of the Independent Review Committee. "I categorically deny this absurd accusation," I said smoothly. "However, since the Vice President of Strategy is so deeply concerned about data integrity, I formally request an immediate, comprehensive forensic audit of my network access logs. I want your internal technology division to pull every single byte of data I transferred, copied, or viewed during the final 72 hours of my employment." Preston's confident smirk wavered for a fraction of a second. He had expected me to panic at the threat of litigation. He did not realize I had operated with surgical, terrifying precision on the day I quit. The audit took exactly 4 hours. We sat in a sterile holding room while the server engineers dissected my digital footprint. When Iris finally returned with the thick printed report, she did not look at me. She looked directly at Preston, and her expression was absolutely lethal. "The logs are entirely clean," Iris stated, dropping the heavy folder onto the conference table. After surrendering her badge, the system confirms she did not access a single internal directory outside of the specific, restricted files she was already explicitly authorized to build. There is zero evidence of unauthorized data extraction. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. I believe that concludes the espionage portion of our morning. But since we are already reviewing forensic server logs, Iris, did the technology team happen to finalize the access report regarding the deleted appendix from the master strategy deck? Iris nodded slowly. The trap I had set weeks ago finally sprang shut with bone-crushing force. They did, and the results are deeply troubling. The technology team traced the exact digital terminal that deleted the warning pages and your authorship credits. The deletion occurred at 2 o'clock in the morning on the day of the board meeting. It was executed directly from the secure workstation assigned to the executive assistant of the Vice President of Strategy. Preston's face drained of all color. He looked as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked from his lungs. In his desperate, clumsy attempt to frame me for theft, he had accidentally forced the legal department to fully verify his own malicious sabotage. He had legally sealed his own coffin. The shockwaves of that specific audit did not stop with the Sun. By the end of the week, the review committee pulled the internal communication archives between Preston and his father. They uncovered a deeply damning chain of encrypted emails, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Warren Bell had been fully briefed on the altered presentation beforehand. The chief executive officer knew perfectly well that my name had been stripped from the documents and the vital operational warnings had been buried. Yet, he allowed the fraudulent presentation to proceed anyway, choosing to actively risk the survival of a billion-dollar infrastructure company simply to artificially elevate his son as the brilliant, unquestionable heir to the corporate throne. With the Bell dynasty rapidly crumbling under the weight of their own documented lies, the true power brokers of the company made their move. Late Thursday evening, Naomi Voss invited me to a private, highly discreet dinner at an exclusive restaurant located well outside the city limits. We sat in a dimly lit corner booth, far away from any listening ears. Naomi did not waste time with pleasantries. She poured a glass of red wine and looked at me with a mixture of profound respect and sharp calculation. "Warren is finished," Naomi said quietly. "The investors have completely lost faith. We are officially scheduling the final board vote for next Wednesday to execute the leadership change. Mason Pike and the institutional funds are ready to clean house. And when the dust settles, we are going to need a new executive vision. The board wants to formally offer you the position of Chief Strategy Officer. You will have a massive corner office, a senior executive salary, and absolute operational control." It was the ultimate corporate dream. It was the exact prestigious title I had secretly coveted for 2 agonizing years while toiling away in the shadows. It was the absolute pinnacle of vindication, taking the very throne from the men who had tried to erase my existence. I looked down at my glass of wine. I thought about the heavy glass boardroom, the suffocating corporate politics, and the endless, exhausting cycle of trying to convince wealthy investors to believe the raw data. "No," I said softly. Naomi blinked, her hand freezing halfway to her glass. "Excuse me. I appreciate the offer. Naomi, I truly do," I explained, my voice steady and completely certain. "But I refuse to go back to being an internal employee. I do not want to be the brilliant mechanic permanently trapped in the basement, constantly patching the holes of a broken, outdated corporate structure. The Chief Strategy Officer title is just a shiny pair of handcuffs. If I take that job, I am still ultimately answering to a board that nearly drove this company off a cliff because they liked a tailored suit more than they liked the truth. Then what exactly do you want, Charlie?" she asked, her eyes narrowing with intense curiosity. "I want freedom, and I want true ownership of the value I actually create," I stated, laying out the bold, unprecedented terms I had been designing since the day I walked out. "I will continue to lead this rescue operation through the entire transition phase. In exchange, Mendoza Operational Advisory receives a guaranteed 5-year exclusive consulting retainer. I want a massive, unalterable performance bonus tied directly to the quarterly recovery metrics. But most importantly, I want you to spin off the new logistical mapping software I'm building into an independent, subsidiary analytics unit. And my firm retains a 25% equity stake in that new unit." Naomi leaned back against the plush leather booth, a slow, deeply impressed smile spreading across her face. She finally understood the true scope of my ambition. I was no longer fighting for simple corporate recognition or a polite apology. A fancy job title could be stripped away by a hostile board vote at any time. Equity, however, was permanent. Ownership was undeniable power. I was not just asking for a seat at their heavy mahogany table. I was demanding to own the actual wood it was carved from. "You are incredibly dangerous, Charlie," Naomi murmured, raising her glass in a silent toast. "I will present your terms to Mason and the funds tomorrow morning. I heavily suspect they will agree." They care about survival, and you are the only one selling the cure. As we finished our dinner and stepped out into the crisp, cool night air, I felt a profound sense of absolute clarity. The upcoming board meeting was no longer about seeking justice or exposing the incompetent men who had stolen my work. It was about executing a flawlessly designed endgame. They had treated me like an invisible, disposable shadow, assuming I would simply disappear into the background. Instead, I had wrapped myself around the very foundation of their empire, and next Wednesday, I was going to force them to sign over a piece of their kingdom just for the privilege of staying alive. The final, deciding board meeting convened on a crisp Wednesday morning. The atmosphere was completely stripped of the arrogant, self-congratulatory warmth that had filled this exact glass room several months prior. Today, the air was sharp, heavy, and smelled distinctly of impending corporate execution. Iris Kellen, acting as the head of the Independent Review Committee, stood at the head of the long mahogany table to deliver the final devastating forensic report. She did not raise her voice, but her measured words fell like heavy concrete blocks onto the polished wood. The committee has reached a unanimous, undeniable conclusion, Iris stated, her eyes slowly scanning the silent executives and nervous investors. We have found absolute documented evidence of gross misattribution of strategic credit regarding the primary logistical recovery model. Furthermore, we have forensically verified the intentional, malicious deletion of critical operational warnings from the master presentation deck. Finally, we conclude there has been a catastrophic, highly damaging failure of corporate governance directly at the chief executive level. Mason Pike did not even wait for Iris to sit back down in her leather chair. The lead investor leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together, his face carved from absolute stone. Let me be absolutely perfectly clear about where my capital investment group stands, Mason said, his voice dropping to a lethal, gravelly pitch that commanded total silence. We are formally prepared to activate the executive sweep clause buried deep within our emergency refinancing agreement. We will legally pull every single cent of our funding by 5 o'clock this afternoon unless this company immediately restructures its supreme power dynamic and fully authorizes the new operational rescue package right here, right now. You are out of time, and you are out of second chances. Desperation is a truly pathetic color when worn by a formally powerful man. Warren Bell gripped the edges of the heavy table, his face a pale, ashen mask of pure panic. He looked around at the unforgiving, hardened faces surrounding him and made one final, miserable attempt to save his crumbling legacy. This is a massive, completely unnecessary overreaction, Warren pleaded, his authoritative baritone cracking slightly under the immense pressure. We are talking about internal administrative oversights. Preston made a youthful misjudgment regarding the slide formatting, and our communication channels temporarily broke down. It was an internal error, not a malicious conspiracy. We can internally discipline him, correct the records, and move forward as a united front. We do not need to tear the entire leadership structure apart over a formatting mistake. I did not let that pathetic, insulting excuse hang in the air for more than a single second. I pushed my heavy chair back and stood up. I did not yell. I did not pound my fists on the table or demand justice. The raw gravity of the empirical data did all the screaming for me. An internal error is misplacing a decimal point on a quarterly budget report, I said, my voice cutting through the thick room with freezing, surgical precision. Intentionally deleting a severe vendor warning to protect your lucrative, private country club relationships is not a simple oversight. It is calculated, deliberate sabotage. Because of that specific, intentional omission, this company bled nearly $3 million in completely avoidable freight penalties in less than 4 weeks. You shattered 3 major delivery milestones. You pushed 2 vital regional hubs to the absolute brink of total collapse. You did not make a harmless mistake. Warren, you made a conscious choice. You chose to protect your own family's fragile ego and your private wealth network over the literal survival of the thousands of hardworking people who actually keep the lights on in this building. Warren opened his mouth, perhaps to launch another hollow defense, but absolutely no words came out. The cold mathematical truth had finally pinned him to the wall, and there was nowhere left for him to run. Naomi Voss took the floor, her expression perfectly resolute and devoid of any mercy. "I am placing a formal, binding motion on the table," she announced clearly. "Effective immediately. Warren Bell is permanently removed from the position of Chief Executive Officer. Preston Bell is entirely stripped of all strategic and executive roles within this corporation. Interim operational control will be immediately transferred to an independent, neutral restructuring officer, mutually approved by this board of directors and our lead investors." The silence that followed her motion was thick, heavy, and absolutely suffocating. It was the distinct sound of a generational corporate dynasty violently collapsing in on itself. Naomi formally called for the vote. Hands went up around the long table. It was entirely unanimous. The Bell faction had just lost their entire empire inside the very same glass-walled room they had so confidently used to steal my life's work. Immediately following the ousting, the board swiftly moved to the secondary agenda. Without a single dissenting voice, they formally approved my exact, non-negotiable rescue package. The legal ink dried on a massive contract that granted my independent firm a highly lucrative, 5-year exclusive consulting agreement. They authorized an unprecedented performance bonus tied directly to my upcoming quarterly recovery metrics. Most importantly, they officially signed over a 25% equity stake in the newly formed logistical analytics unit that I was actively building from the ground up. When the meeting finally adjourned, Preston Bell stood up from his chair. He did not look at his father, he did not look at the investors, and he certainly did not look at me. He picked up his expensive leather portfolio and walked out of the heavy glass doors in absolute, freezing silence. He was a ghost, completely stripped of his unearned armor and his stolen titles. Several months later, I heard through the tight-knit industry grapevine that a rival logistics firm had briefly considered hiring him for a senior director role. They stopped the hiring process abruptly at the reference check stage. When their recruiters dug past his polished resume and desperately looked for the actual, verifiable achievements he claimed to have engineered, they found absolutely nothing but empty air. His executive career was permanently over before it ever truly began. Warren lost the coveted, powerful throne he had so desperately intended to pass down to his son. He was quietly ushered into a forced, deeply embarrassing early retirement, entirely banished from the industry he thought he owned. As for me, I did not ask for my old desk back. I did not return to the cramped third floor to reclaim my former cubicle and pretend everything was normal. I walked out of that building possessing something infinitely more valuable than a plastic employee badge or a fancy corporate title. I walked out possessing absolute, unbreakable control over my own name, my own income, and the entire trajectory of my professional future. At the absolute end of the fiscal year, Asteron Fleet Technologies published its massive, publicly available annual shareholder report. Right there, printed beautifully on the glossy second page, was a highly detailed summary of the miraculous logistical turnaround that had officially saved the company from total bankruptcy. My name was printed exactly where it belonged. The board explicitly named Charlie Mendoza and my independent advisory firm as the sole architects of the restructuring strategy. It was the exact, formal recognition I had silently begged for over 2 agonizing years. But this time, I had not asked for it. I had violently forced them to write it into their own permanent historical record just to save their own remaining shreds of credibility. On a bitterly cold Columbus afternoon, I stepped out of the massive glass doors of the headquarters for the final time that week. The icy wind whipped aggressively through the downtown streets, but I felt entirely warm. I pulled my heavy wool coat tight and walked toward my car. I did not look back at the towering corporate structure behind me. I did not need to. I had finally learned that the most perfect, devastating form of revenge is not screaming at your enemies or making a dramatic, emotional scene to make them feel temporarily ashamed. The ultimate flawless revenge is methodically forcing the very system that tried to crush you to legally sign a binding document confirming that every single brilliant, beautiful, and successful thing keeping them alive was created entirely by you. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support the channel even more by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.